So it seems there's a thin line between being members of the judiciary and being a politician. In fact, some judges have recently made political comments and even joined political parties.
So analysts have been divided on this. Some say this is democracy at play. Others say this line should never be crossed. So, of course, this comes after former Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng was announced as the All-African Alliance Movement leader. Let's unpack the story further. We're joined now by Angelo Fick, who is the Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute. Angelo, as always, thanks very much indeed for coming on. I've got so many little biblical sayings, but perhaps let's kick it off with a broad statement from you around whether judges should be entering the political fray.
Good morning, Michelle, and to your viewers. I don't think that judges should be in this space because the whole point of the separation of powers doctrine is that we should have decisions made by judges that are clearly motivated by issues of law, and that it shouldn't come to a point where somebody who then is the head of a political party or ends up going to parliament will have their choices and decisions when they were on the bench second-guessed because of the new politically professed beliefs. The whole point of the judiciary is that they should be impartial and that it shouldn't matter what a judge's views are. And I think in the specific case of former Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng, there is a second set of issues, which is about the many, many professed beliefs that he made when he was still on the bench, and how that will play out in the political space.
Yeah, he's been perhaps called, the Moses that South Africa needs. Is he going to lead us to our Damascus moment and perhaps to the promised land? We can all agree, right? South Africa does need a Messiah. But exactly this issue around the specific challenge insofar as Mogoeng Mogoeng is concerned. So many different statements, moments come to mind during his time as Chief Justice. At the height of COVID-19, there was his prayer against vaccines of the devil meant to infuse 666 in people's lives. It's just one sort of questionable moment that comes to mind when one thinks of him.
Well, I will have to be a little bit heterodox here and say that I don't think we need a messianic figure. I don't think we need salvation by one leader. I think for too long South Africans have invested in this idea that someone will come and save us. I think we all have to work together and work together through the institutions of our society and through the organizations that we belong in, whether the places we work in, the places of faith and worship that we go to, the schools that we send our children to. That's the places where we have to work to deepen democracy and to strengthen accountability. And then we have our civic duty to hold our politicians and elected officials to account. It's not just that the Chief Justice then, made remarks that we can think of as slightly odd. It is that he didn't have the better judgment to know that in his position as Chief Justice, those remarks and views should remain in the private space. And it is that poor judgment that I think would make one wonder whether somebody who's now as a former judge, and there is a whole lifelong tenure issue around judges and the ability of the state to recall judges to serve on all sorts of commissions and the pensions that they get paid. For that person to now come forward and say they'll lead a political movement, one has to wonder whether, again, this is precisely the point that you've made, the need for messianic figures rather than the use of people who can play a role in transforming our politics. Because yes, our political space does need to be transformed, and that means changing our political parties, the organizations, and the people that we choose in them to lead them and to serve in them. But I don't necessarily think that judges are the way out, because again, you are taking your, shall we say, status from one field into another field where that status really has absolutely no role to play. And I think the ability to separate these things, to draw Venn diagrams and to be able to say these things should have nothing in common with one another, and we should remain separate in these spaces because the health and wealth of our institutions, that's at stake when we start crossing boundaries and having people serve in multiple spaces.
I suppose this sort of desire for some kind of messianic figure, Angelo, comes from the moment we're in as a country, right? People are really desperate. We're in a desperate moment in so many different spheres of our country. Mogoeng himself and his prayers of leading the nation back to the Lord, well-intentioned as they might be, I want to talk more about him bringing his personal religious beliefs into his very public statements that he's made. why is that a slippery slope from there? And perhaps we don't even have to look that far in our country, just in the news that has been making headlines over the past couple of weeks. The issue around the protection of sex workers, for example, has once again been in the headlines. Roe versus Wade in the U.S. and abortion rights, again, have been top of mind. Why is it a slippery slope from praying for the country to these issues?
So I think many South Africans and many people who live in South Africa have lived in a society in which there was no separation of church and state, in which in apartheid South Africa there was an established church, and the established church protected the immorality of the government of the day because it was dependent on it and needed to justify it. And we came through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the Dutch Reformed Church issued an apology for its role in this crime against humanity. We can look around the world and we can look back in history. The theocracies do not work well. When you have ultra-religious people at the top of the state, often what you then sit with is a whole series of problems throughout the state because some people do not qualify for the largesse that these religious figures promise. Iran is a recent example of people really going up against the state because of the theocratic system in place. We've had other examples of such theocracies around the world where really ordinary citizens' rights were not served. In the case of former Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng, it's the idea that he was the head of the judiciary in a secular state, where many people are professed Christians, that's not to be doubted. But those professed Christians do not necessarily share those ideas in terms of the governance of the country. And yes, obviously there is a deep-seated desire for messianic salvation, but we must also recognize that some of our desires are deeply irrational. We weren't saved by individuals, and we're not going to be saved by individuals. And so one's religious faith and the ethics that come with it plays a very important role in the way in which we behave with one another in the state, in the society, in public. And also in private. But this is a state that is governed by the Constitution, and there will be direct conflicts between people's individual professed beliefs and the Constitution, because the Constitution protects everybody's rights to their belief and actions within a certain kind of rule-bound frame. And I think what the former Chief Justice may have to take into account is that while he may believe that his particular version of Christianity is the route to salvation for the entire country, this is a pluralist society in which millions of people, one, aren't Christians, two, aren't even religious, and their rights need to be protected as well. And when it comes to the issues that you've mentioned, women's rights, rights to reproductive health, the rights of transgender and homosexual people, all of these issues may become deeply complicated in a society that prefers one set of religious beliefs and a particular iteration of that religious belief as the dominant belief. Now, it begins with when you elect very religious people into high office, and they then take that religious belief and turn it into lawmaking. And we have parties in this country dedicated to that, and they may play very important conscientizing roles in opposition, but very few of us would like to see them in power, which is why they gather the few votes that they do in election after election.
Well, in the meantime, the All Africa Alliance movement has its presidential candidate as the former Chief Justice, Mogoeng Mogoeng. They've not yet registered with the IEC because he's still an employee of the Judicial Council. So he's still, working as a judge, so to speak. But once they have done so, and once they get ready to contest these elections, would it bring into question, Angelo, the work that Mogoeng Mogoeng did during his time on the bench, during his time as head of the judiciary?
So in this particular kind of scenario, and in scenarios like these, it's often not even the substance, it is the perception. And the perception of the judiciary as independent and as impartial and as above religious disputes and the beliefs of individual judges, and as dedicated to the letter of the law and the spirit of the law as enshrined in the Constitution and all the laws subsumed under it, that is what is in question. And so a rational adult, a person who takes great responsibility for their actions, would ask, should I be serving in multiple contexts? Now, I think what I see this kind of maneuver as is the social media biographication of life itself, where people think that they can do all sorts of things, list them in their social media biographies, and don't notice the contradictions between them. We would all like to be all sorts of things, but in a rational world, we have to make decisions about where we're going to place our focus. A late-in-life conversion to politics might feel like a nice idea, but like any other judge or senior counsel or prosecutor, it is important perhaps for the figure who is the judge, and I'm not just here talking about the former Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng, but anybody in that particular role may have to think very, very carefully about what the consequences would be. Reverse this and suggest that somebody who used to be the head of a political party is now appointed the chief, to a senior judicial position. People would balk at the idea because they would have concerns about the politician bringing their views into the judicial space. And we should have the same concerns in the obverse case, which is a judge who was expected to sit on the bench and be impartial and took this position knowing that it would be for life, now wishing to enter the political fray with what he calls, or what anybody in that view would call, a moralizing imperative. I don't think what we need is this. It is, I think, a misdirection and very misguided on the part of Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng. And I think one needs to be very careful about simply supporting this because one shares some of the moral principles of the former Chief Justice and some of the great concerns that many millions of South Africans have about the current political tradition. All solutions are not necessarily better solutions. We may need to work towards more creative and imaginative better solutions that do not require of people to cross over between those three branches of government.
Angelo Fick, as always, thanks so much for your analysis on this story. The Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute. Thanks very much indeed for coming on.